Welcome to Consider the Sources. The color tells the story. I'm Linda Randulfe. Today we are live from the Benjamin Powell House at Colonial Williamsburg to talk about how scientific analysis, documentary research, and fieldwork help us learn about the colors of the past. We'll get to your questions very soon, so please go ahead and start posting them in our comments. Before we do that, let's introduce our team of experts. Matt Webster, Executive Director for the Granger Department of Architectural Preservation and Research, and Kirsten Moffitt, Conservator and Materials Analyst. Why don't you tell us briefly about what you do here at Colonial Williamsburg? And Kirsten, let's start with you.
Great. I manage our Analytical Lab, so we're part of the Conservation Department. And I work with our curators, conservators, and sometimes even historic area interpreters to use scientific methods to better understand our collection materials.
And Matt, what about you?
So we're the Department of Architectural Preservation and Research. So we, and within our department, we oversee the preservation of the historic area, making sure that the buildings survive well into the future. And we also oversee accuracy, including interiors, as well as overseeing the architectural collection, which has about 18,000 fragments in it.
Well, we have a lot to talk about, but to get us started, let's learn a little bit more about what goes into paint analysis.
We look at buildings and try to figure out the age of them all the time. And we want to know the age of the building, so as it relates to the historic area, as it relates to individuals. And there's many methods we can use to do that. The most common is technology.
Paint analysis at Colonial Williamsburg over the past century has really evolved, as has the entire field of paint analysis. We know a lot about pigments and paints used in 18th century Williamsburg, and that's both from analysis of the physical evidence, but also from studying documents of the time. We know what pigments were being imported and being used. My main process of analyzing architectural paints is certainly the microscope. So on site, I'm going to collect a paint sample. And the way that I do that is I use a surgical scalpel to collect a very, very tiny chip of paint. I'm going to gather them in very small Ziploc baggies or vials that are labeled with information pertaining to the sample location. And then I'm going to take those paint chips back to my laboratory. First, I study them with a stereo microscope, so I'm able to look at the paint chips under higher magnification. And then I'm able to find the chips that look like they contain the most paint evidence. Then what I do is I cast those chips in a small cube of polyester resin. So that kind of holds the chip in place for further preparation and analysis. I can cut that resin cube in half and thus exposing what we call the cross-section surface of that paint. So I'm able to see all of the layers that were applied to that surface or substrate over time. So further preparation and additional polishing makes that surface mirror smooth for high-power microscopy, which allows me to look at those cross-section samples under visible and ultraviolet light. Those two types of light both give me very pertinent information as to the materials that are present in the paints. In an ideal sample, I'm able to see the substrate and all of the layers that were applied over time up to the current surface. For instance, if a door has 20 paint layers and the frame around it has only 10, we can often deduce that the frame was added later because it has fewer paints. So it's that type of comparative analysis that's also extremely helpful. We have a lot of other fascinating instruments in the lab that I can apply to the analysis of paints. So one thing that we have is an XRF, which stands for X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. And this is actually a handheld XRF, so it kind of looks like a ray gun. And I can actually point it to a painted surface, and it uses X-ray energy to tell me what elements are present in that surface. So that's particularly helpful for understanding components of paint, like, for instance, if we found titanium in a white paint, that would mean titanium white was present. And titanium white was not introduced to paint until around 1920. So understanding the elemental composition of a paint can tell us a lot about the date. We also have a scanning electron microscope, and that goes over 100,000 times magnification. So we can really get extreme magnification of our samples. I'm able to look at a cross-section in the scanning electron microscope and target each particular layer to get the elemental composition of each layer. I also have something called an FTIR in my lab. FTIR stands for Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy, which is why we call it FTIR for short. But that instrument uses IR energy to identify organic components in a sample. So using FTIR, I can identify a latex paint versus an oil-based paint or Limewash. So that's very helpful. I also have, lastly, a microscope colorimeter. So that's how I get the color matches from the paint samples. So because this is a microscope/colorimeter, I can actually get color readings from the very, very tiny paint chips that I've collected earlier from the buildings. And so that will measure the early colors in a color space that is essentially numerical, which I can then plug into a mathematical equation and get the closest commercial match. That's what our painters use if, for instance, they're repainting the building. But those swatches also go into our paint reports, which become a part of the permanent record of the building. So we're very lucky here at the Foundation because we have an excellent library with a trove of records that date back almost an entire century. And I do want to mention that all of our instruments in the lab were donor funded, so we're very grateful to our excellent donors for helping make this type of research possible.
Welcome back. Matt and Kirsten are here to answer your questions, so please go ahead and post them in the comments. Kirsten, let's get started with you. How does someone get into the field of paint analysis? What was your experience?
Well, I actually have a graduate degree in art conservation. So I studied art conservation at the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation. And to get into a graduate conservation training program in the United States, you need to have completed coursework in studio art, art history, and general and organic chemistry. So I did that, entered the program, and I was very interested, and always had been, in architectural paints. And when I was in the program, I got really, really interested in analysis, particularly the microscopy of historic paints. And so that was something that I was able to really focus on in my studies when I was a student. And then I was lucky enough to come here to Colonial Williamsburg for my third-year internship, which is kind of like a full-time residency, and to stay on ever since. And so I've always been studying architectural paints and doing microscopy, and that's spread into studying all of our collection materials and helping establish our analytical lab.
It sounds like there's a lot of different fields of expertise that come into play.
There are.
So roughly how long would you say it takes to get into the field?
Oh, it's so different for everyone because there isn't one specific way that you get into paint analysis. I think everyone gets into it differently. Certainly all of my colleagues have come from very different backgrounds. But I actually have a bachelor's degree in fine art, and when for the first few years out of school, I was actually a decorative painter, and I was doing faux wood graining finishes and faux marbling finishes in people's houses. And those are the same types of finishes that we sometimes find in our buildings here. So I was always interested in paint and color, and then I did a lot of apprenticeships and internships in museums and with other conservators before going into graduate school to pursue that.
Well, thank you. Well, to add on to that, Erin wants to know when you got started in this kind of work.
Well, it really wasn't until I was in graduate school. So before that time, like I said, I was working as a decorative painter and then as an assistant with other conservators. And for me, this is not usual, but it took me over a decade to get ready to where I needed to be to get into graduate school. But it was really, again, in school that I really started to focus on microscopy, and so it's been since then, so over a decade, that I've really been focusing on the analysis of paint.
Wow. And Matt, what about you? How does someone become an architectural historian?
So there's a lot of programs out there. University of Virginia, Clemson, Columbia, Penn. And like Kirsten said, there's many different routes into the field and many different specialties that you can go into. But usually it's through one of those avenues of higher education. And then there's also the experience, getting out there in the field, doing work with historic societies and other museums, and that experience is invaluable as well.
Well, talking about your experience and the years it takes to become an expert in this area, what do you do if there is no paint evidence on a house? How do you go about starting your study?
So it's a great question, and it's fairly complex. But usually, what we do is we look at documentary evidence. We want to know about the people that lived there, the type of house that it was, which will help inform what colors would have been used, or even what kind of coatings would have been used. Is it an oil paint, or a tar paint, or a whitewash? And then we have an incredible amount of analysis that's been done, not only here in Williamsburg, but we really focus on the 18th century. So going beyond Williamsburg and understanding color and paint in the 18th century, because it represents the individual in the structure, and it tells a story. So it's not as simple as just, going out and picking a color that you like. There's a lot behind that color in the 18th century.
So how does this type of analysis help Colonial Williamsburg develop the Benjamin Moore paint line?
And so we can call on the years and years. I mean, really, since the 1920s, we've been doing research on paint colors. And so we can call upon that work, and especially the modern day analysis. And that's the core of the Benjamin Moore line, which I think is really important. It's really the only line out there that calls upon the analysis of actual historic structures to develop a color line. And then to expand that line, one of the things that we did is we actually looked at advertisements from here in Williamsburg during the 18th century to see what pigments were for sale. We ordered those pigments, we made paints the same way they would have in the 18th century, painted them on boards, and then Benjamin Moore took those boards and did modern color matching and formulation for those colors. So really, it's really important to us that color line is in line with what would have been here in the 18th century.
Yeah, but when Benjamin Moore reached out to us and talked to us about developing the color line, the very first thing that I did was pull all of our old reports, and I filled up a binder for the people at Benjamin Moore saying, these are all the blues that we've found in the past, here are all the reds. So it's really very much an evidence-based line, which is really unique.
Yeah. It's so important that Colonial Williamsburg has been able to take the time to document and make the research apply to a commercial paint line. That's really very interesting. So how would you say the Colonial Williamsburg Benjamin Moore paint line is different from other paint lines?
Well, I think, as we touched on earlier, it's just that it is evidence-based. It's not perhaps some other commercial lines are not quite taken directly from scientific analysis, and whereas ours was, Benjamin Moore was very interested to know what I had been finding in my lab, what kind of analysis I did in my lab, and how I performed paint analysis, and everything that we had discovered over time, and how could all of that be encapsulated in the current line. So it's very much evidence-based, and that's really special.
Yeah, and it was a great experience. I mean, they really turned over the color choices to us. That the evidence, like Kirsten said, the evidence led to the decisions, and that was a really great experience.
Excellent. Well, Kevin would like to know what buildings at Colonial Williamsburg have coatings that really surprised or stumped you?
Well, there's quite a few. We were talking a little earlier. The vibrant colors. We often think that 18th century is all these muted tones and kind of grungy colors, but it's not. It's a really, really bright world in the 18th century. So I think some of the greens, especially the verdigris, they shock people. People have a real reaction to that. But I think it's an amazing color because I like it from a functional standpoint. If you wanted green, that's your green, and so I really like that. I don't know what your...
Yeah, I mean, I guess what pops into my mind right now is the Orpament-based paints that we've been finding. So in the last year, I discovered in a number of our houses, in at least 3 or 4 of them, a yellow pigment called Orpament, which was apparently, according to historic treatises and all that we thought that we knew about what was used in house paints historically, it was never used in house paint. It's this bright yellow pigment, but all of the treatises talk about how disgusting it smells, that it was a horrible smelling pigment and you should never use this in a house because it's going to, quote, drive your family out of house and home. I remember that in an 1829 treatise. So then we found it, I couldn't believe it, found it in one house and then ended up finding it in 3 more. And so it really kind of like rewrote what we thought we knew about the materials used to make historic paints. And so that was something like really exciting. The pigment was also supposed to fade over time, and yet it was a brilliant yellow in all of the paints that I had found it in. And so, this was something that I also shared. I published it in a paper, talked about it at a microscopy conference. Like another important part of what we do, I think, is scholarship, and we want to share these discoveries with the public. It's not just in paint color, but we want to, let everybody know about the types of research we're doing here, and it affects the field overall, so we want to contribute to that scholarship.
Excellent. Well, we've got quite a few questions coming in. Isabel would like to know, where were pigments sourced from in the 18th century
Cool
to create?
question.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I mean, really all over the world. I mean, it's a
Global trade.
global
Yeah.
trade. Yeah. So, there's evidence of pigments from Asia, Europe, not really everywhere.
But we were importing our pigments from England.
Right.
But the English pigments were coming from everywhere.
Right.
So, I mean, verdigris in the 18th century, which is a green copper acetate pigment, that was coming from France. And then white lead was made, I think, primarily, it was called the Dutch process lead, so made in the Netherlands. A lot of charcoal blacks and tar could be sourced in Sweden because they had a lot of pine trees. So it's really an interesting global trade, really coming from all over.
Well, that leads to Susie's question. She would like to know, what is a tar paint, and is it oil-based?
Oh, good question.
Yeah, it does have some oil in it. So it's tar, so it's pine pitch. So
it's a resin.
A resin, right. And so, but then it's usually boiled with oil and
we add
turpentine.
oil.
So it's not as simple as just you're putting tar on the building. They're thinning that down.
What other interesting materials help create paints in the 18th century?
Limewash is a very common paint. Another term for it that's not always used correctly these days is whitewash. But when we talk about 18th century limewash, we're talking about a thin lime, an actual lime-based layer, which was made by, in Williamsburg, calcining oyster shell, and in other locations, limestones. We actually make our own. We can actually make our own limewash here.
Right.
It's a very brittle coating, but we do, and we find it, it's not the kind of coating that you would find inside a wood-paneled house. You would find it more on outbuildings.
Right.
And and it would be a bright white, and it was very cheap, plentiful, could be applied often.
Well, Leslie would like to know, how do you know, and why were bright colors so fashionable?
I think because they were not, today we can go to any hardware store and you can pick any paint you want.
Right.
And that was not the case back then.
Yeah.
Bright color was special.
Right. Bright color was special, and it's what they had. So, you didn't go in and have multiple variations of blue or green. You had the base pigment that you had to deal with. So really, that's what you were working with, and even some of those, they're unstable, so they would react to their environment and shift in color and things. You had, where you're going to use the color came into play as well, interior versus exterior.
Bob would like to know, have you been able to match any political figures of the time with the color they preferred?
I mean, one of my favorite,
a great question.
yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, there's definitely letters about color, and whether they preferred it or not, I'm not sure. I don't think I've seen where they say, I really like this color. But, they're choosing color based on fashion a lot of times. And so that's playing into this. Today we think about color a lot with aesthetic. Like what we like, to them, it was part of education, understanding fashion, which was status. So color, the colors that you were using showed status to a degree. But some of my favorite letters are, in George Washington's painting with Prussian blue, which is a blue pigment at Mount Vernon. He's talking about how his overseer's talking about how the painter didn't mix the paint properly, and how it was getting streaky because it would hit batches of pigment and be dark blue and light blue. And so you get some of that, the interactions of the painter and the owner, and the kind of tenuous relationship that sometimes occurred, because he was definitely not not happy with this painter. So.
A lot of excellent questions, but right now, let's switch our focus to one building in particular. We visited the Travis House, which is now the home for our joint programs and projects for Colonial Williamsburg and William and Mary. Let's learn a little bit about the Travis House, and remember, please continue to post your questions and comments.
The Travis House project is a paint analysis project that I'm working on with our Department of Architectural Preservation and Research.
Color in the 18th century, it's telling a story.
This is a chance for me to study the house using paint analysis as an investigative tool.
The objective of our group is the preservation of our historic resources, as well as accuracy, presenting an accurate environment for our visitors to interact with history.
A lot of our visitors tend to think that the paint color just gets chosen arbitrarily, and it's just a matter of modern taste. However, it's really not. It's really a big collaborative effort, and paint analysis is just one part of that, to help us really understand the complete history of a building and tell the story of the people who lived there, and also portray as accurately as possible for our visitors when they come visit Colonial Williamsburg, that they are getting the most accurate portrayal of those interiors and exteriors as they appeared during the Revolutionary period. And color is a huge part of that story.
The Travis House has a complex history. It's built in several phases, starting in about the early 1760s, and it adds to the building up through the 1780s.
My part in this research is I collect paint samples, which I then analyze back in my laboratory, and I'm able to look at the various layers of paint that have been applied over time to the original elements from this house. And I'm able to not only better understand the original colors that were used in the various spaces, which of course gives us a better idea of how the house might have originally appeared at various periods in the 18th century, but being able to compare the various layers that I identify through analysis also can sometimes give us very important clues about the structural history of a house and how it has changed over time. We know that it was built in three very distinct periods. The current western end was built around 1765, then the central portion was constructed, and the latter easternmost portion was built around 1790.
It's a home in the beginning. It then goes throughout time, becoming, I believe, a tenement at one point. And then even once it comes to Colonial Williamsburg, the early restoration, it wasn't completely formed. So some buildings actually did move around town, and this is actually one of the ones that did. It moves over near Palace Green. It's used as a tavern for a period of time. The restoration evolved. The building didn't belong there, so they moved it back to the site where we are today, where it was originally located. And then it turns into a residence, it turns into offices, and even today now is the office for a cooperative project between Colonial Williamsburg and William and Mary. Here at Travis, we have fragments from a building that's still standing. So we can use those and we can compare and contrast information from the fragment to the building.
By comparing the various layers of paint throughout the interior, the layers of paint are going to reflect that structural history and give us further supplemental information about when those changes happened and why.
The evolution of a building, it tells many, many stories, and this is a great example.
Welcome back, and thank you for that peek at a building guests don't normally get a chance to see inside. But we do have some more questions, and one of them is, why did the Travis House get moved so much?
So it's just circumstances, really. So the house is bought in 1848 by Eastern State Hospital, which is a mental hospital, and it's used for many, many purposes. Well, in the 1920s, it was threatened with demolition as they were expanding the campus, and Colonial Williamsburg was just at the beginning of what we were doing here. And so they actually, Colonial Williamsburg purchased the building and moved it from the site to the foot of Palace Green. Later on, we came to the conclusion that we're restoring the town, so therefore we should not be putting buildings that that weren't there in the 18th century. We should not be putting them into town. So we then decided to move it outside of the historic area in the 1950s. We then purchased the property where the building had stood originally, and in the 1960s we moved it back to its original site. So we actually moved the building 3 times.
3 times. The Travis House got around. So Joyce would like to know, what do we know about the people who actually lived in the Travis House?
It's a great question. We don't know a lot about the people that originally lived there, but the house is actually named after a man named Champion Travis, who moves in around 1796 and lives there until the 1830s. He lives there with his sons. And so it's named after him. He lives there for the longest period of time. And then, I think one of the people that is most fascinating is a woman named Lena Robert. And she actually is the head chef at the tavern, when it becomes a tavern at the foot of Palace Green. And she's a famous chef from New Orleans. She actually writes a cookbook in 1939, and she goes on to New York City, becomes a head chef there, and then comes to Williamsburg around 1943 and becomes a head chef. And she's our first African American head chef here at Williamsburg, and then goes on to New Orleans and is the first African American woman to host a cooking show in the United States. So it's a really very interesting story.
That's fascinating. Ross would like to know if there are different colors painted on a house during the 18th century. How do you choose which one of those colors to put on the building?
Oh, that's a good question. Sure, because houses are painted so often over time, so when I'm looking at the samples under the microscope, clearly there's multiple layers on multiple elements. So the way that we choose is the target of our interpretation period for the historic area is the Revolutionary period, so 1770s. So knowing the age of the house and looking at the number of paint layers, we can typically estimate what layers we think are associated with that time period, and are they appropriate for the time period. So it's done in that way, and then of course, we'll have discussion about it. How do we feel about that color scheme, and so we'll move on from there.
How many actual layers of paint have you seen on some of the buildings?
I would say that what's typical for an interior of one of our structures that's been repainted over time, typically I'd say about 20 generations of paint. So painted a little less frequently in the first century or so, maybe every 10, 20 years. And then after the buildings are owned and restored by Colonial Williamsburg, our maintenance becomes much more regular and the buildings are painted more often.
Well, that leads to a good question, which is, painting is a big undertaking. What is it like to keep track and maintain the many buildings here in the historic area? So
we have a very active paint and repair program here. So we basically take into account paint life expectancy. We have over 604 structures here that we oversee, and so we have to paint roughly 70 to 80 structures every year to keep up with paint life expectancy, because paint's that initial barrier of protection for our buildings.
Well, thank you, Matt. So Lonnie would like to know, can paint analysis tell us anything about the use of various rooms in a house?
Yeah, it can, and that's especially why I work with our architectural historians, because they can take the information that I give them. I'm just giving them data, I'm just giving them information, and then they can really interpret it and understand how the building was used and how visitors would have moved through that structure. So for instance, one thing that we do find over and over again is that in the best room of the house, so for instance, the room with the more refined woodwork would be the room where visitors would first see and would be entertained in. And in those spaces, typically we find the more expensive pigments. Pigments like verdigris green is a really great example, and that's a copper acetate pigment. It's just made from the corrosion crystals you see on copper, like the Statue of Liberty. That's actually the pigment, but this was a quite expensive pigment relatively in the 18th century, and when we find verdigris in our buildings, it's typically in the best room of the house. So that just gives us an idea of how that particular space was used. So that's one example.
And you know, in space use, I mean, it really, there's some fascinating examples throughout the United States from the 18th century, and some it's really interesting because in public spaces you see oil paints used, but the second that you get to a space that's out of eyesight, it goes to whitewash. So they immediately just kind of downgrade spaces in some cases, and so it's so space to space, it will definitely change.
It's interesting how some colors apparently had, if you will, a bit of status attached to them.
A hierarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Kevin would like to know, when analyzing the paint samples, do you see any indications of weather conditions or other environmental effects?
Yeah. Good question. So in addition to the layers and the colors that have been applied over time, really important clues for me are things like layers of dirt that I can see under the microscope that are in between layers. If there's a lot of dirt, and sometimes I can even see mold under the microscope, if I see a lot of dirt and mold accumulated on the surface of a paint layer, I know that it has been exposed for a long period of time. And paint can also have a lot of deep cracks, and that's another clue that something's been exposed for a long period of time. And our colleague Patrick Beatty over in England has this great example. He's a paint analyst who works on a lot of buildings in the UK, obviously, and he has this wonderful sample taken, I believe, from a building in London where you can see, it's white paint, but you can see all of the soot layers in between every single layer until this one year, I think it was mid-20th century, when there was an environmental law put into place, and all of that soot suddenly is gone. You can actually see it captured in the paint. So yeah, sometimes it can give us a fascinating insight into environmental conditions.
Excellent. Matt would like to know, can these paint colors be purchased from Benjamin Moore?
Yes, and so the color line, it's a commercial line, so you can go to Benjamin Moore dealer and get these in the Williamsburg color line.
Right. Ross would like to know what sheen is most typical of the paint inside used.
Oil-based paints, traditional oil-based paints, the sheen is typically semi-gloss or eggshell.
And Stacy would like to know, how long does it take a typical paint analysis project to get resolved?
A typical paint, and there is no typical paint analysis project, but they can take quite a long time to complete because for a house with a lot of intact woodwork, and we here at CW we tackle interiors and exteriors at different times, but even for an interior paint study, I could take over 100 samples. And then we might need to keep going back to the house depending on what I'm finding, where we think that we need to focus more of our efforts. But it can take months to years. And I'm working on a lot of other projects in my lab at the time too, so it all depends on what else I have on my plate. But it can take quite a while. It's an immense undertaking.
Because you're also working with really thin layers oftentimes, and very small, a small fragment can tell you something, correct?
I often tell people that doing an architectural paint analysis study is like putting together an immense puzzle where half the pieces are missing and you don't have the picture on the box.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. Joe would like to know, what tells you if a paint layer is older or newer?
Well, older paints or pre-industrial paints were hand ground. So you couldn't go to the hardware store and just buy any bucket of paint you wanted. House painters actually made the paint on site. So they ground up they combined their powder pigment and their linseed oil, and they ground it by hand using a heavy stone or something called a muller. And so when they painted out those coatings, which they did with brushes, which dragged through the paint, when I see those paints under the microscope, I see a lot of chunky pigment particles. So those are the artifacts of the hand grinding. You can never really grind those pigments down totally fine. And yet, if a paint is industrially prepared, we see very, very fine, very small pigment particles, all of a consistent size and shape. And there's a lot of additives that go into modern paints, biocides, chemicals so that it won't bubble, it will dry faster. And those layers in cross-section under the microscope tend to look very, very even and very smooth. And so typically if I look at a large paint sample, I see a lot of those chunky coarse paints at the bottom that are prepared by hand, and then I've got those smoother paints at the top, and I know that those are my post-industrial paints.
So how consistent would a color be since they were mixing the paint right on the spot?
That's a good point. There is some inherent variation in an early color because it was hand ground. And so for that reason, when I'm measuring historic paint for a color match, I'll measure a sample in a few different areas and then I'll average together the values.
All right. Lou would like to know, how much more is there still to study? You know, hasn't it all been found out already?
No. You know, and I think that, you know, what happens is that you're always coming up with new questions, one. And two, as technology advances, we can answer new questions. I mean, even since I've been in the field, which has been about 20 years now, the difference between what we could do then and what we can do now is just night and day. It's unbelievable what Kirsten can do in her laboratory and the questions she can answer. And you know, it's really up to us to continue asking those questions and continue pushing. If we had stopped in 1928 when we did our first analysis, you know, where would we be today with our understanding of color and what the 18th century world looked like?
Well, as we start to wrap, what is one of the most surprising things that you have found out in your line of work?
Yes, well.
Well, I think, well, I already talked about the orpiment that I found, and that was something very surprising to me, but I guess it's not necessarily surprising, but I can give you what I think is a really good example of a great sample that has always been memorable to me. And early on when I started here, I was analyzing paints in the Finney House, one of our original 18th century buildings. And I sampled from the hinge on the door, and I sampled from the door itself. And so when I looked at the paint sample, I could see that throughout, you know, the first 10 or 20 paint layers, the door and the hinge had always been painted the same. We tend to not, you know, people may not realize that hinges were painted along with the woodwork, but it was painted the same color. So we had these rich chocolate browns and olive greens and deep blues. But then suddenly you get to this early post-industrial period where the hinge was painted black and the door was painted white. And that was clearly colonial revival scheme. And I used that sample in a lot of my lectures about paint analysis because I think it really clearly visibly shows that the colonists loved color, they loved bright color, and this whole black and white aesthetic was actually not based on evidence at all. So like that's a memorable sample for me.
Matt, what about you?
For me, I mean, there's so many. I think that in general, it's getting that window into the past to see what life was like for people, and to see evidence of you know, a person living in the 18th century. So there's a lot of that for me. I really like process and function. So we were talking during the break, you know, seeing roping, so seeing where the bristles of the brush pull through the paint and understanding the process of creating all of this is what's really fascinating to me, and we do that every day here. So it's pretty amazing, you know, the finds that we have on a regular basis.
It seems like there's a story behind every color.
There is.
All right.
Absolutely.
So what does paint color tell us about the past and about the lives of those folks who were living here in the 18th century in Colonial Williamsburg?
Yeah, so there's a lot of aspects to color. It's rooted, I mean, it's telling you about global trade in the 18th century, so what's available to these individuals. And then, you know, personally, you know, you're seeing there is an aesthetic aspect to it, but it's also a status. Fashion is knowledge, and knowledge is power. And so that's the hierarchy of society, is that, you know, those colors and what's fashionable, and are you painting your house the most fashionable color, and how expensive is that color? It's telling you a lot about an individual. And you can walk down the street today and see that story. In fact, in one of my favorite houses, just a block away from where we are today, is the Davenport and the Moyer house. So we have the Davenport house is painted brown. We know that in the 18th century, around in the 1780s, that the value of that house is very, very low. It was built in the early 18th century, and that the family had fallen on hard times. So we painted it a brown color, kind of an out-of-date color for that time period, and a cheaper color. And next door is the Moyer house, a gentleman who's on his way up in society. He's wealthy. He's just built a new house. So we painted it a yellow color to show, he's keeping up with fashion, and he's doing something a little bit more expensive. So you're seeing that play on colors to tell you about the people that lived in those buildings.
Well, thank you both. Paint can be a surprisingly complex topic around Colonial Williamsburg, so thank you, Kirsten and Matt, for sharing how much detailed research goes into decisions and about the paint colors used. Colonial Williamsburg relies on the generosity of guests and donors like you. This project was funded in part by a generous grant from the National Endowment of the Humanities. We hope you'll join us on December 17th to follow a day in the life of our Historic Interiors and Collections Care Team, the folks who take care of our historic buildings before they are open for visitors. And remember, when you're considering history, always consider the sources.